This is Taking the Lead, a podcast for B2B tech professionals, leaders, and executives who want to learn from female icons in the tech industry. In each episode, host Christina Brady interviews women who are driving revenue for some of the most respected tech companies in the world. Are you ready to get inspired?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Taking the Lead. I am your host, Christina Brady. I have an incredible guest on today, Nakhi. We are going to get to her in a moment, but first, I want to kick it off by thanking our incredible partners, Women in Sales. If you have not heard of Women in Sales, they are focused on elevating, empowering, and promoting women within the sales profession. And in order to realize this vision and create a more equitable sales team in the future, they know everyone has to be a part of that conversation and contribute toward that progress. And through facilitating conversations, sharing resources, and enabling sales professionals, they believe that we can help mold the future of sales to be more inclusive, which is a beautiful dream. And if you would like to get involved with them, head over to www.women-in-sales.com and join the conversation on Slack. With that, Del, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Christina. I love the mission of Women in Sales. So huge shout out to them and what they're trying to do and how you're supporting them as well.
Oh, thank you, Alexine, the CEO. You hear that? You're doing great work, girl. Keep it up. Keep it
Absolutely.
up. Speaking of doing beautiful things in the world, you have a wonderful journey. You have now tapped into the incredible world of being a CEO of your own business, and you are tackling a really key and fundamental issue in companies today, which we're going to get to in a moment. But before that, talk to us a little bit about your professional journey and how you found yourself where you are. I know there's been some twists and turns along the way. Tell us about them.
Absolutely. Like as with anybody, right? There's always twists and turns. That's what makes it fun and keeps it interesting. So, what I found is that there are two key areas that I typically focus on. One, first and foremost, is really wanting to have an impact and help people be successful. Full
Mm.
stop, period. I just love doing that. And the second thing I've realized about my career is that I'm a natural problem solver. So I call myself the forest and the trees gal because I'm very detail oriented, sometimes to a fault, but I also see the bigger picture and can balance the two and problem solve with the root cause in mind. So, I started my career in nonprofits. I love the opportunity to have an impact on underserved populations. And the other piece was missing for me, which is having a broader organizational impact. So transition into for profits, worked with B2B as well as B2C companies in different industries, including educational services and technology, financial technology. And really, probably the past 8 years of my career has been really focused on revenue enablement, which is this beautiful marriage of the two, of really having direct impact on individuals and leaders and also helping businesses thrive and grow. So, from there, as much as I really loved and enjoyed my roles in enablement and found the lovely enablement community that you know and are familiar with, which is just such a blessing because there's such amazing people within the community that I've been able to connect with. The other aspect that was missing and something I've always aspired to do is start my own business. And the reason I really started thinking about that is just noticing three common gaps in every single company I've worked with, everyone I've talked to at different companies. And those three gaps are really first and foremost a lack of investment in leadership development.
Mm.
And related to that is actually a focus on a discipline and ability to manage organizational change, especially at the leadership level. And the reason that's important is from personal experience, I've found it to be the event that tests your leadership skills the most is when you're managing organizational change. And the third piece, which is kind of a result of the two, but there's other nuances that impact it as well, is a lack of employee engagement. So, with my company, Lead to Catalyze, which I officially launched just a few months ago in November, the focus is really, to use coaching, consulting, and leadership development to help companies and clients bridge those gaps and close them.
Which is such a need because When I think about every organization that I've been at, there's always been this kind of unspoken rule that like the leader eats last, right? Like
Right.
all the training, all the resources, all the enablement, it goes to the customer facing folks and the individual
Right.
contributors or to marketing or whatever it may be. And there's this idea that like, well, the leaders are strong and tenacious and talented and they'll figure it out. Um, and then they don't because
They
they're
don't.
human beings too and they need support. And so you mentioned kind of these three gaps as you were looking to go from working traditionally at an organization to then starting your own. Why focus here and why do you feel like this is the right sole place to lean in on? Like if so many
Yeah.
companies don't see value in investing in leadership, why do you say that they're wrong?
Yeah, I love that question. And I wouldn't say that necessarily they don't see the value in it. I think it's just an oversight.
Mm,
So often we have individual contributors that are doing so well and they're so talented that we're like, we're going to give them a leadership role and they're going to lead the team to success. And we fail to recognize that leadership is a learned skill, it's not born. I think that's a misconception that is out there. And while there may be some characteristics that may make you a little bit stronger in some aspects of leadership, overall it's a skill that needs to be developed. And I think it's that oversight that we need to start having these conversations and taking a step back and not assuming that a strong individual contributor is going to be a strong leader. The skills are completely different.
oh my gosh, you hit on such a critical point there, this idea of the natural leader, right? We hear it all the time. You're a
Yeah.
born leader, you're a natural leader. How did you know that you had the calling to be a leader? And I crazy enough, I feel like not enough people talk about the fact that leadership is a learned skill. We think we have to identify leaders by them standing out somehow. Like
Yeah.
I don't know, almost like American Idol, like the leader must be discovered, like you were discovered. You're a leader, congratulations, right? So when you say that it's a learned skill, you're right. You're right. But how do you learn how to be a leader or how do you identify an amazing leader or somebody that has that potential? What should companies look out for there to really get it right?
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question because it's not necessarily, again, it's not the intrinsic qualities, it's how do you develop the qualities across
Mm,
any leader that you promote, right? So I think if you're looking at evaluating if this person is going to be an effective leader, I think how open are they to feedback? You might think the other way around where they're giving feedback to their team, but they need to be a mindful leader. I recently started my own newsletter focused on mindful leadership for that reason. They need to be mindful and open and see the humanity in their team and want to help them be successful. But that alone, that desire is not enough. So then it's up to the company to supplement that with the training that's needed on core, management skills in addition to more strategic leadership skills.
mm. Do you think that every company should have their list of skills that they look at and almost put leaders through a similar type of onboarding that they would a BDR or an AE or a CSM? Should they have their own path of learning and development?
Absolutely. I think having capabilities built out by role is essential, especially for your leaders. I'm starting to see it a little bit more. I'm starting to see some roles just purely focused on leadership development. And the challenge with that is it's usually larger companies that can afford to have a dedicated person focused on that. So then we can also talk about how as an individual leader, you can develop your own skills. But I think it's something that is starting to move in the right direction of people recognizing the importance of that, having onboarding programs specific to leaders. So I think that is a positive trend that I'm observing.
Yeah. And I think about too when you go into an organization, I'm guessing that one part of what you have to do is almost this like an intake, right? Like you have to
Right.
observe. There's going to be the company's perception of their leadership, and then there's going to be what's really going on. And do you
Yeah.
find when you're going in and you're working with these organizations that there's a little bit of dissonance there, right? That what the company says is the problem with leadership versus what is actually the problem with leadership. How far apart in a lot of instances do you find that those two things are?
Absolutely. And I think there've been studies on this very fact where leaders feel like they're engaged with their employees as a whole, much more than the employees feel that there's that proper engagement and they're getting the support that they want and need. So I think it's really important to assess that, assess your culture, your employee morale, and what is actually happening. So you can't talk to leaders alone. You have to see both sides of that equation and talk and have those conversations to evaluate what's working, what's not working. And I think the key to remember is everyone is well intentioned. Employees are well intentioned, leaders are well intentioned, but without the skills, it's really easy to fall into those common traps that make you ineffectual as a leader and make you seen as someone who's a micromanager or someone who's difficult to work with, all these different things. And as leaders, heavy is the head that wears the crown expression kind of comes to mind. It can be really challenging, especially if you want to do really well. And I've experienced this myself in my early leadership career. I've wanted to help. I'm such a passionate person and care about people so much, but I've fallen flat on my face because I didn't have the tools and skills I needed to be successful in supporting my team.
Do you think it's just a matter of folks not knowing what those are? Like you mentioned, like kind of these pitfalls that folks fall into, or these really common mistakes that are made. Dive more into that. Like as you think about all of the companies that you help, what can you go in and just predict? Be like, I don't know for sure, but I'm gonna guess that you've got these 4 issues, right? Like, what are the
Right.
ones that you're like, I always see these?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's interesting if we center this around coaching because I feel like coaching captures some of the core skills that leaders need to have to empower their employees to do really well. So that includes active listening, it includes understanding and tapping into motivation and motivating your team to succeed. It includes delegation and driving accountability. So some of those skills in particular, I hear so much around delegation, especially for individual contributors stepping into their first leadership roles or early on in their leadership careers. So, those are just some of the common gaps that I normally see that we might overlook initially.
Let's stay there. Let's live there for a minute. Let's move in to the apartment of delegation because when I think back, my first leadership role, I want to say it's maybe like 15 years ago. But I remember that there was this one, there was no training, no onboarding, and not that much has changed now. Certainly no coaching, right, for
Yeah,
leaders. Like it was like either if you had an amazing VP or RVP who happened to be an incredible coach, and I had those for some roles as well, then you got the great coaching. If you didn't, it's like, figure it out, you're a leader now. Delegation is a big one because especially if you are a newer leader or you haven't had that coaching or haven't had that development, you think to yourself, the buck stops with me. I hold the bag. I have to solve everything. I have to know everything. I have to understand everything. And you almost feel guilty or like you're a bad leader if you delegate. If somebody comes
right,
to you or you're given a project and you go, you know what? I'm going to take that. I'm going to honor it. I'm going to put it over here. You feel like
right.
I'm now failing as a leader. So, how do you overcome or shift the paradigm around delegation and teach folks, coach them on how and what to delegate? That's a tricky one.
Yeah, and so many people talk about, the best leaders look for gaps in their own skills and hire for those gaps, right? Hire smart people, let them do what they're good at. So it's a
Yeah.
little bit of that understanding of you're not going to have everything figured out. You're not going to have all the answers. You're not supposed to have all the answers. That's the other thing to your point. There's this misconception that sometimes we have, especially early in leadership careers, of like, I'm supposed to have all the answers and figure everything out myself. But that's really not it. And what people want the most and what helps get employees really engaged is giving them the opportunity to have an impact in areas that they're really excited about, they're passionate about, that maybe challenges them a little bit as well. So, finding a way of tapping into that and understanding those facets of your team, being that mindful leader that has those kinds of conversations. What do you love to do? What are you good at? You can find ways to align things that need to be done with those skills. And sometimes it's going to be slightly out of their reach. So you'll need to coach them through that. But that is going to be so much more fulfilling for them. They're going to perform so much better as a result of that. And they're not going to resent you for taking the lead on a bunch of different things. And being in the limelight. And so many people point to micromanagement, which if you don't delegate, that can kind of lead to that.
Well, and let's did you mean to say taking the lead? Because
I
excellent
know.
job. I loved it. I was like, yes, yes, take the lead.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about how delegation and micromanagement are kind of awful cousins of each other and how one leads to the other. I find that a lot of leaders who don't have a great coach have a difficult time determining when am I delegating, when am I inspecting, when am I micromanaging, how am I holding people accountable without doing that, and trying to find the balance there is
Yeah.
really, really difficult. And so, how do you work with somebody to help them identify the difference in those, we'll call them skills or behaviors or attitudes and how they're deployed? How do you make a meaningful difference there?
Yeah, and I think it's finding a good balance. I really like how Kim Scott puts it in the book Radical Candor, where she
Oh,
talks about you have to care personally and
yes.
challenge directly. But you can't have one without the other, especially the challenging directly. If you only focus on that and your team doesn't know that you really truly care about them, their well-being, their success, then you can't really do the challenging and delegating and helping people step out of their comfort zones as well. So build that relationship. And one other thing that she mentions in her book is try to get feedback first before you give feedback as much as possible, especially as a new leader, whether it's in a new leadership role or you're stepping into a new company, whatever that opportunity is. Don't seek to give feedback first, seek to receive it first. And that changes the dynamic where they're much more open, because what you want to be able to do is have those conversations and say, do you feel like you're getting what you need? Do you feel like you're having opportunities for growth and development and taking on some of the ownership and responsibility of what we're trying to accomplish as a team? You're not going to be able to ask those questions without creating the right environment within your team to be able to do that.
Well, and that can be scary too, right? I mean, it can
Yeah.
be scary when, because I remember I think most people have had what we'll call an ineffective leader. Had an
Yes.
ineffective leader, most of the time very well intentioned. Like I honestly can't think of instances where I've had poor leaders that had bad intent. They just misguided. They needed you to coach them, candidly. And they didn't have you. They didn't have you. And thus they were making our lives miserable. And there's that idea that they never actually get the feedback they need from their teams because they haven't created a safe environment for honesty, right? So what that would sound
Yeah.
like is I remember distinctly at a company that I worked at, my leader is sitting in my one-on-one and being like, I would love to get some feedback from you just on, my effectiveness as a leader. Am I giving you what you need? Am I communicating to you properly? Like, what could I do better? And in that moment, I was like, I'll be damned if I'm going to be honest with you about that. Can't, you're a horrible communicator. You micromanage the heck out of us. You don't provide the right support. Like, I'm not going to say that because
Right.
you're in charge of my income. You're in charge of my career development. You're in charge of my brand. So what I would say back is, I think you're doing great. I think you're just the absolute best. You're doing great. Well, that leader then leaves that room and goes, "Man, I am killing it." And they keep doing what they're doing, right. So
Right.
how do you break that? How does the ineffective leader actually get that candid feedback that they need versus, and this happens too much, versus that, well, I
Yeah.
asked them if everything was cool and they said everything was cool, so I guess I'm great. And then
Yeah.
people leave and they don't know why.
Yeah, and the cost of attrition is so great, and
Yeah.
it's very true that people leave managers, they don't leave companies.
Ugh.
That's been my experience as well, and I think it's to your point, you can't ask the question if you haven't created the right environment. If you've been leading your team for a long period of time and that is the current culture, it's gonna be hard to change that. Culture change is one of the hardest things to actually accomplish. The success rate is somewhere around 20%. So it's going to be hard to make that change. But if you're making it in earnest and you're having those open conversations and you're willing to take a look at yourself in the mirror and accept accountability for some of the things, again, even if you're doing it unintentionally, you're not trying to hurt your team, you're not trying to upset them or be a certain type of leader. It's a lack of awareness, I think, that is really the key to overcoming this obstacle, is building that awareness and being more mindful about how you're approaching conversations, and even having a very frank conversation of like, I don't think I'm doing as well as I'd like. And I want to do better. I want to do better by you guys. I value you. I believe in you. And I want to figure out how we can improve our team dynamics and how I support you guys to effectively execute and contribute and feel really engaged. So let's talk about how we can do that and what you need from me. Try to create as safe of a space as you can, to your point, to have those kinds of conversations. But I will say it is challenging if you've been doing what you've been doing with your team for years. So the
Yeah.
answer to that, I think, is coaching and then taking a step back and really working on your leadership skills and working on leadership development.
Well, there's also something that you identified there that sounds like this high level of self-awareness, which I
Yeah.
think you could say that that could be trained, or you could say that that's something that's intrinsic. Maybe the answer is somewhere in the middle of that. But the approach of I am self-aware enough and I have a low enough ego to be able to identify that I'm ineffective in these areas. And this is the
Yeah.
data that I'm looking at to determine that I'm ineffective in these areas. And instead of going to my people and asking them to validate that, because that's very uncomfortable for them,
Yeah.
instead, I love your approach of, look, I've proactively identified that I have these areas that I can work on because I want to make this working relationship better. And here's what I've identified. And if I'm able to
Right.
put these things in motion, would that feel like a better working environment, right? Because then you're not
Yeah.
telling them, do you think I'm a good boss or not? Every time somebody asks
Right.
me, they're like, do you like me? Okay, so like, do you like me at all? Like, do you like me? And I'm like, well, it's kind of a weird question. Like, no,
Yeah.
yes, I don't know. So that is an interesting approach, is just presenting with, here's what the change is going to be. And maybe if you do that enough times, people start to feel comfortable being like, well, actually, that's not the issue, but like, could you try this? Like, it becomes more
Right.
of this sort of sharing environment.
Yeah, I love that. And that allows for you to show that you're taking ownership. And I think that's where leadership development can be really helpful, is to bring about that self-awareness, especially if you're able to do the leadership development with your peers. So one interesting statistic I came across years ago was, I believe by Gallup, it was the average age of a first time leader. It was around 30. The average age they go through leadership development for the first time is 40. This was years ago, and I think the average age of a first time leader is lower, but that gap has not reduced down in any way, shape, or form. But for me, I've been in leadership roles for nearly 20 years, and I only went through my first training about 5 years ago. So that statistic holds true for me, sadly. And one of the first things that we did was dig into perceptions of me as a leader from my peers. And that was such a difficult experience, but so empowering at the same time, because knowing that I can actually do something about it. You do have to be willing to receive that. And again, as difficult as it may be, it can make you such a more impactful leader and so much more fulfilled as a leader. But those conversations outside of your team can start you on the path to becoming a more mindful, successful leader.
I mean, it's beautiful. And what you're talking about too is that there is no such thing as a perfect leader. There's
No.
always something you could do better. There's always something that you could be learning. There's always a way that you are being somewhat ineffective for your people. But this
Yeah.
idea of, I'm always aware, I'm always looking to improve, I feel like that's almost a culture thing that can be caught in a good way
Yeah.
amongst organizations, is that humble approach of, I'm always trying to punch above my weight class and be more effective, and I care about the
Yeah.
feedback that you give me on the working relationship that I'm creating for you. That's huge.
Yeah.
What nuance do you see? Because, obviously the leader's job is to coach their people. And when you're coaching a leader, you're it's like multiple levels of inception. Like, you're
Right.
coaching the coach. How what opportunities do you give to coaches of coach to be able to identify effectiveness? Because that's tough, right? You're not sitting in one-on-ones listening to them talk to their people. You're not necessarily on every single customer conversation. You're not sitting in all of their team meetings. And especially in a remote dispersed workforce, if you're a coach of a coach, how do you even identify the trends that you need to come in and impact?
Yeah. That can be challenging. I think, especially if you can't have some of those conversations with the people they are coaching, it's going to be a bit of a challenge. But if you're able to take them on this journey of self discovery and understanding their core values, how they see things, challenging them to see things potentially differently, that can help open it up where you can open their eyes to a different way of doing things or a different way of thinking about things that they wouldn't otherwise. There has to be that willingness to engage in that with you, but I think that can be a really powerful and valuable experience.
Well, and I think too, maybe some of your self-reflection has to come into that. As a leader, unless I'm sitting on the C-suite, I likely have folks below me in the hierarchy that I am having to coach, and I have folks above
Right.
me that I'm having to manage up and be coached by. And so for me, sometimes the onus winds up being on that middle level leader to identify their shortfalls and
Yeah,
then fix them going down, for lack of a better word, but then also manage them going up, right? How do I
absolutely.
proactively surface and identify my own gaps? Do you find that there's a 10-year difference between folks who can identify gaps versus those that can't? Like, do you find that new leaders have a hard time identifying where their gaps are versus more tenured leaders, or is it kind of a toss up?
It might be the other way around a little bit more because if you've
Ooh,
been doing what you're doing for years and years and you're in a certain practice and you're not as self aware of it, you think you're doing a good job because you've had success in your career. You've been in leadership roles for a very long time. So I think newer leaders are a little bit hungrier for that kind of introspection than someone who's really established and been in leadership roles for a while. But I do love that you're pointing to something that I think is also missing in leadership development, which is when we do coaching, it's always for the executive. So let's get an executive coach for our most senior leaders, but not
right.
necessarily the middle managers who have the brunt of the weight of getting that execution to be consistent and effective for you to have that impact that you need as a team. So I think that's another gap that I've noticed is that we don't focus enough on middle management.
Why do you think that is?
I think it's knowing the level of responsibility that our executives have is so great that we want to invest in making sure they're successful, but they can't do it on their own. Every level of leadership below them is responsible for their success as well. So it's just realizing that that needs to be supported and nurtured just as much as those executives, if not more.
It's not an easy problem to solve, but I you know, but this is why I think, the fact that there are more and more folks now that are coming and they are addressing this problem directly, doing what you're doing, saying we're gonna focus on these individuals because, I mean, talk a little bit about the business impact of actually having effective leaders, especially at that middle management level. Like, there is a business reason to invest there. What are some of the ones that you would tell to that exec table as to why they should be investing in their middle management?
Yeah, absolutely. So one example we touched on it briefly is attrition. So if people are actually leaving their leader, not the company, the cost of that attrition is tremendous. And there's all kinds of studies around that. It could be X percentage of their salary is the tangible cost to the organization, let alone the resources that were invested in their professional development and onboarding, as well as the recruitment process, all of the ways that we bring new hires into our organization. It costs us to lose them, especially when we've invested in their growth and development. So that alone is one reason to really focus on that. The other is just the effectiveness of the leader determines the effectiveness of the team in a lot of ways. And I
Ooh.
think that touches on employee engagement as well. So if you have a leader who is maybe not that strong as a leader, not mindful, not present, not able to delegate as effectively and really uplift their people, empower them, drive accountability as successfully, those people disengage more, which means that they're not giving you even 50% of what they can offer as an employee. So you lose that productivity from that individual employee and multiply that by the number of people that leader is managing. And that impacts the organization's bottom line because they are not contributing the value that they were hired to contribute. And it's not entirely in their hands. We need to empower and educate our leaders to be more effective, to be able to overcome that.
Woo. Empower and educate our leaders to be more effective. That is a phenomenal line to drive us into the end portion of our conversation, the rapid reveal, where on top of just learning all about your skills and all of the value that you are providing to all of these leaders, we want to learn a little little bit more about you if you are up for 3 questions from me with 60 seconds or less to answer each. Are you ready?
Absolutely. Hit me with them.
Let's do it. All right, number 1. I always like to start with a softball, but 1, what's your favorite thing to do on a day off?
So I moved to Colorado about 3 years ago, and it's absolutely beautiful here, especially when the sun is out, which it is out today. So going on a beautiful hike, there's a lot of like nature, animals around, and I grew up primarily in Southern California, so this is a much different environment, and it just grounds me so fully that I love it.
This is not on the list, but have you seen like an animal that has shocked you? Like what I remember when I was a kid, my dad had friends that had a cabin up on like a hill, a mountain in Vermont.
Yeah.
And I saw a moose one time and you think moose are like the size of a cow. They're not.
They're
They're
huge.
they're like the size of a school I mean, this thing was larger. I was like, "That's a moose?" Like, I just remember being like, "Oh my god." Have you seen any wildlife in Colorado where you're like, "Wow," when you just weren't ready for it?
I was super excited to come across a bald eagle just walking through this
Oh.
nearby state park that we have, and I walked all the way under him. He was sitting on a branch, and it's just so breathtaking, and I've seen them several times, and I hadn't seen one in real life before, so that was like a profound moment because I love animals, so it was just such a meaningful moment.
Oh, I love it. I love it, and this may or may not lead into number 2, we're gonna see, but what's an irrational fear of yours?
It's actually not related. So I have a pup. Her name
Animal.
is Abby, and she is about 3 or 4 years old. We don't know. We adopted her about a year and a half ago. She's a pit bull cattle dog mix. Overall, she's really smart, but she thinks with her stomach. And she is not a slow eater. So she eats really, really quickly. And my irrational fear is we always crate her when we leave the house. So we give her a little treat. I'm going to come back to her having choked on a treat that we left her with because she's just scarfing it down. So irrational, yes, but I love the pet.
I mean, that but I feel like any irrational fear that is within the realm of realism, you
Right.
know? Like, I'm always afraid that if it's a really deep swimming pool, there's gonna be a shark in there, and that's completely irrational because a shark can't survive in pool water. Who put the
Right.
shark there? It's not like there's a pipe like that, but I feel like yours it's close enough where you're
It's
like,
close enough.
"This could be very scary." Yes, alright, number 3. Who has been the most impactful person in your life and why?
I gotta give a shout out to my hubby. My husband is Alan, and he's just been such a rock for me, especially this past year, making all these changes, starting my own company. I am investing in getting my coaching certification. I also enrolled in an MBA program that I'm starting this August, and he's just been such a support system and feel so loved and so seen by him that he's just made all the difference.
Aw, we love that. That's wonderful. And speaking of shout outs, thank you for such an incredible tactical conversation today. If folks want to get to know you, if they want to use your services, if they just want to build a relationship with you, how do people find you?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for this conversation. I always enjoy talking with you, Christina. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. Send me a DM if you have any questions, if you just want to talk or chat. I typically take meetings. I'm pretty open to supporting however I can, even if it's just a single conversation. If you want to learn more about Lead to Catalyze, it's just leadtocatalyze.com. And I would love to hear from you and feel free to tap subscribe on my newsletter for some insights on leadership and being more mindful as a leader.
Oh, we love it. Thank you so much for coming on the show. You're absolutely brilliant.
Thank you, Christina.
And that's all, folks.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Taking the Lead. If you're looking for more inspiring stories from women leaders in B2B tech, then visit us at motionagency.io/takingthelead.